Expectancy theory. Expectancy theory refers to the notion that certain antecedent musical events lead one to expect a consequent musical event. In language, a single word might have meaning. In music, however, a single isolated sound like a tone or chord rarely has meaning. At least it usually doesn't have musical meaning. This lack of meaning doesn't include non-musical sounds such as a telephone ring or a doorbell. These sounds have an associated meaning like someone is calling or someone is at my door. Here are three simple examples of how musical events create expectations. Click on each antecedent event here to see how easy it is to anticipate the consequent event. Before going on to more musical examples, notice how expectations are not always met. The example shown here is called a deceptive cadence because it deceives the listener. The ending is not what one would normally expect. Here are two examples from Bach chorales illustrating a full cadence and a deceptive cadence. The ending cadence is given, along with the full phrase in which the cadence occurs. Here is a deceptive cadence from the second movement of a Beethoven piano sonata. In the final chord of this passage, our ears expect an E major chord, but we get a C-sharp minor chord instead. Here's another way a composer can deviate from expectations. This example, from another Bach chorale, provides a surprise in the last chord. The passage is in A minor, but the final chord is in A major. Music theorists call this a Picardy third. Musical expectations can be melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, timbral, expressive, that is, based on phrasing or dynamics, or formal, based on organizational properties. Often, expectations are set up by more than one musical element. In the examples that follow, there's little attempt to make distinctions between these various influences. Rather, it's more important to simply note how one musical event creates expectations about what's likely to follow. Perhaps one of the things that makes a great composer is the ability to create expectations, then deviate from them by an infinite series of surprises, some of which are sudden, and many of which are subtle. In both of these examples, the first phrase sounds incomplete. It creates an expectation that what follows will bring resolution, closure, and completeness, but it doesn't. Try playing these phrases in reverse order or mixing phrases from the two movements, and notice how these sequences lack completion or closure. In these examples, expectation is set up by the theme. In each variation, Mozart walks a tightrope. If he makes the theme too obvious, the piece will begin to sound repetitive, and the listener is likely to find it boring. If he makes it too difficult to hear, the result might be confusion or frustration rather than the pleasure of recognition. These variations could set up endless expectations, but Mozart clearly brings them to a close with his conclusion to the sixth variation. Compare these two excerpts from the Beethoven C major sonata. The first example, from the exposition, creates certain expectations. Having set up these expectations, Beethoven can later insert several surprises and deviations in the coda. Here are the beginning and ending measures of the opening of the second movement. Beethoven begins in E major, but inserts a sudden and unexpected shift to E minor in measure 11. Now, compare what Beethoven does when the same passage is repeated later in the movement. The first excerpt provides the first and last measures of the opening phrase. The second excerpt provides a comparative ending. In this passage, notice how Beethoven lulls you into a certain expectation. In this case, the unexpected change comes in the dynamic level. Compare the first two measures of this movement with a repetition near the end of the movement. Notice how Beethoven delays the cadence point in the second example. At the very end of the movement, Beethoven delays the final cadence, stretching it out to bring it to a final conclusion. Listen to the way in which Beethoven sets up expectations in the first presentation of this theme, and then immediately deviates from that expectation. The previous musical examples have been used to illustrate the expectancy theory, the notion that certain antecedent musical events lead one to expect a consequent musical event. We've also heard how Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven deviated from established expectations by a variety of means. Another key concept is that the ways in which expectations are met or not met have a great deal to do with our emotional responses to music. If listener expectations are too frequently or consistently met, the music may not be sufficiently engaging. Thus, music appropriate for very young children, like the ABC song, might be boring to adults. On the other hand, music that creates vague or confusing expectations may also fail to hold the listener's attention. Here are two examples that are quite opposite in their level of expectations. Can you predict what note will follow next? Having expectations met or not met is not the only consideration in our responses to music. But notice in the first example, Joy to the World, how providing the last note, in your mind or out loud, creates a sense of closure and is psychologically satisfying. The fact that you're less likely to accurately predict the note that would follow next in the second example, the Schoenberg Piano Concerto, Opus 42, certainly doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the piece. However, this makes it more difficult for most listeners. The most enjoyable musical experiences vary from individual to individual, of course, and most likely result from a very complex series of interactions involving listener attributes, properties of the music itself, and situational circumstances. Expectancy theory provides one key to understanding how we derive pleasure from the musical experience.